Most people live their entire lives mistaking their ego for who they truly are. But what if everything you think is you, your thoughts, your identity, even your trauma, is just a mask? Carl Jung didn't just study the mind. He cracked open the doorway to something deeper, something ancient, something terrifyingly real. The self isn't your personality. It's the force pulling the strings behind your entire existence. And if you keep ignoring it, it doesn't just fade away, it takes over. Sound dramatic? Then explain why you keep repeating the same relationship patterns. Why you sabotage success right when things get good. Why a quiet sense of emptiness lingers, even when everything seems fine. That's not bad luck. That's your unconscious screaming for attention. Jung warned, what you don't make conscious will control you from the shadows, and you'll call it fate. The self, when denied, becomes projection, chaos, depression, addiction, until you finally turn inward. But here's the wild part. Once you do, everything starts to change. You'll begin to see how virtue isn't morality, it's survival. You'll recognize your projections, reclaim your identity, and tap into a power that religion tried to sanctify and modernity tried to suppress. This isn't therapy, it's transformation. And in this video, we'll unravel Jung's most intense revelations about the self, from the unconscious forces that shape you to the spiritual destiny waiting behind your shadow. Are you ready to meet the one person you've never truly known, yourself? Chapter 1. The concept of the self in Jungian psychology. The idea of the self, according to Carl Jung, isn't some vague philosophical concept. It's the silent compass behind every twist in your personal story. While the ego might shout loudly about who you think you are, the self stays behind the scenes, watching, integrating, nudging you towards something deeper. It holds both your conscious self and the unconscious contents you haven't dared to face yet. Think of it like the director of a play, while the ego is merely the actor improvising on stage. That tension between what you know and what you've buried is exactly where transformation brews. Now, here's the kicker. The self doesn't just represent who you are, it also whispers of who you could become. This is what makes individuation such a wild journey. It's not about becoming someone else, but about reclaiming every disowned part of you. The guilt, the shame, the weird dreams you've been ignoring. Those are messages. They're calls to balance the dualities inside you. Light and shadow, order and chaos, virtue and instinct. When you answer that call, you're not fixing yourself, you're integrating. Let's break this down. Imagine someone who always prides themselves on being good. Never angry, never selfish, never bitter. Sounds noble, right? But Jung would call that a one-sided ego. Eventually, the unconscious revolts. Maybe it starts with dreams of violence, or sudden outbursts they can't explain. This is the self knocking, saying, hey, your shadow's leaking. It's not punishment. It's nature trying to heal the imbalance. If you want a starting point, try journaling your emotional triggers or studying dream symbolism with Jung's man and his symbols. The self isn't just personal. It plugs into the collective unconscious. Archetypes like the anima or shadow aren't just yours. They're shared blueprints of humanity's psyche. And that's where things get spiritual. Paganism, for instance, projected these archetypes outward into gods and rituals. Christianity internalized them, calling for a moral effort, for inner virtues to face these inner forces. Both paths whisper about a deep truth. You're not alone in your psyche. You carry the echoes of those before you. But here's the twist. The ego resists this integration. It wants to believe it's the boss. Yet, real power comes when the ego bows to the self. Not in defeat, but in union. That's where destiny steps in, where fate isn't just a script you're handed, but a path you co-write with the deepest forces within. And if you're wondering how this dance between ego and unconscious begins to unravel, well, that's where the story of projections truly gets wild. Chapter 2. Ego and Projections. The ego loves to think it's running the show, but Carl Jung made it clear. It's more like a flashlight in a foggy forest. Sure, it helps you see a little bit ahead, but most of the terrain is still hidden in shadow. And it's from that very shadow that projections emerge. Those unconscious contents you haven't integrated, yet insist on meeting in the world around you. Suddenly, your boss becomes your tyrant father, or your new partner feels too perfect. That's not reality talking. That's your unconscious handing out masks. These projections often stem from the anima and animus, those deep archetypal forces representing the inner feminine and masculine. They aren't cute metaphors. They're powerhouses of emotion and expectation. You might fall in love with someone not because of who they are, but because they activated a buried piece of your psyche. It feels like fate, but really, it's the collective unconscious playing dress-up through someone else's face. Ever had a crush that faded the second you got to know the person? That was a projection fading back into the mist. What's tricky is that projections distort perception. You swear you're being rational, but what you're actually doing is outsourcing your inner chaos onto the world. You blame your partner for being too emotional, when really it's your own disowned vulnerability knocking. You attack others for being too selfish, unaware of your own suppressed ambition. Jung didn't just want you to be aware of these dynamics. He wanted you to own them. And here's how. Write down emotional reactions you had today. Ask yourself, is this really about them? Or is this a reflection of me? The ego, without integration, becomes fragile, easily overwhelmed by unconscious contents. Projections build up like emotional static, blurring your reality until you snap, ghost, or sabotage. And when enough people share the same projections, boom, you get mass movements, ideology wars, and charismatic leaders manipulating collective energy. That's the dark side of the collective unconscious. What starts as personal distortion quickly turns into societal delusion. Think mob behavior. Think mass panic. Think manipulation through ideology wrapped in morality. But here's the thing. Projections aren't the enemy. They're signposts. Every time you feel irrationally triggered or overly enchanted, it's a clue. Something within you is trying to be seen. And if you're brave enough to trace the thread back to its origin, you'll stumble upon the gateway to individuation itself, a process that demands more than insight. It demands moral effort, but that's a journey for the next step. Chapter 3. Individuation and Moral Effort. Individuation isn't a luxury, it's a spiritual necessity. Carl Jung described it as the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are by integrating what lies beneath your conscious identity. It's not about self-improvement hacks or personality tests. It's the art of walking into the forest of your unconscious and making peace with every part you once rejected. The ego wants to believe it's complete, but individuation whispers, there's more. And to embrace that more, you need to stop clinging to who you think you are. This is where moral effort enters the scene. It's not just about being a good person. It's about developing virtues that allow you to face the unconscious without collapsing. Take humility, for example. Without it, every insight turns into ego inflation. You start thinking you're enlightened just because you spotted your shadow once. Jung warned about this trap constantly. Real growth. It's the quiet kind. It's the strength to admit you're still learning, even when others praise your wisdom. Let's get practical. Say you notice you're always irritated by loud people. Instead of judging them, pause. Ask yourself, what part of me wants to be loud but isn't allowed? That discomfort is gold. It's the unconscious knocking, offering you a chance to integrate. A useful exercise? Start a daily trigger journal. Write the event, your emotion, and what archetypal energy might be surfacing. Over time, you'll start seeing patterns, voices of the anima, the animus, the shadow, wanting space at your internal roundtable. Without moral effort, individuation becomes a spiritual ego trip. People start projecting their unconscious contents into cosmic fantasies, believing they're chosen or superior. That's ego inflation in disguise, an unconscious merger with archetypal energy. You don't become divine by avoiding your flaws. You become whole by facing them. This is where virtue acts as ballast. Courage to see, patience to sit with discomfort, integrity to act. Not performatively, but honestly. And yet, the deeper you go, the more you realize individuation doesn't offer comfort, it offers clarity. You become less reactive, more real. But the next challenge is even trickier, because while you wrestle with your personal unconscious, there's a much bigger beast looming, the historical consciousness shaped by collective energies. And that's where the self meets the tides of time. Chapter 4. Historical Consciousness and the Collective Unconscious. Historical consciousness is one of those things people overlook until it slaps them in the face. Carl Jung understood that you're not just a product of your childhood. You're a carrier of history. You walk around with centuries of collective, unconscious energy pulsing beneath your choices, your ideals, even your taste in music or partners. That's why individuation can't happen in a vacuum. If you don't understand the forces that shaped your culture, your religion, your family roles, you risk confusing inherited beliefs for personal truths. Let's take nationalism, for instance. It's not just politics, it's archetypal. It taps into tribal memory, ancestral loyalty, the ego's craving for identity. When you see people ready to kill or die for a flag, you're witnessing the collective energy of history moving through them. But it's not always that dramatic. Even your belief in romantic love, career success, or gender roles, those are shaped by cultural myths passed down through generations. To grow, you got to step back and ask, whose story am I living? A practical way to do this: trace your beliefs. If you believe a man should never cry, or life is about achieving success, ask yourself where that idea came from. Was it your grandfather, the church, a war-torn family legacy? Maybe it's rooted in Christian virtues, or maybe it's leftover from pagan traditions of stoicism. Either way, the goal isn't to reject your heritage, it's to see it. Because once you see it, you can choose whether to live it or transmute it. And here's where things get real. Most people aren't making conscious choices. They're acting out historical scripts without even realizing it. They fall into ideologies, movements, and roles that have been carved out long before they were born. Jung saw this as a psychic danger. If you don't cultivate historical consciousness, you become food for the collective unconscious. You'll mistake mass hysteria for moral duty, or worse, call it destiny. That's not individuation. That's possession by history. So, the task is to reclaim your timeline, to become not just a product of fate, but a conscious participant in it. And when you start recognizing the archetypes behind your culture's obsessions, you begin to see how paganism and Christianity didn't just shape religions. They built psychic maps. And those maps still live in you, guiding or misleading, depending on how awake you are. Chapter 5. Paganism versus Christianity in Psychological Terms. When Jung compared paganism and Christianity, he wasn't just talking religion, he was mapping the psyche. Paganism, in psychological terms, externalized the archetypes. Gods of war, love, fertility, and chaos weren't metaphors. They were real energies experienced and acted upon. It wasn't just a myth. He was the animus in full force. Dionysus wasn't just a party god. He was the shadow, the instinct, the wildness people couldn't integrate. Paganism offered a way to engage with the unconscious through ritual and symbol, even if it meant staying fused with projection. Christianity flipped the script. Instead of acting out unconscious contents, it began to internalize them. The war moved inward. The battle against sin? That was the ego trying to wrestle with shadow. Christ as the symbol of the self, the reconciler of divine and human, offered a model for individuation. Instead of appeasing gods, Christianity called for virtues: humility, truth, forgiveness. These weren't just moral demands, they were tools for integration, for confronting the unconscious without being consumed by it. Still, each system has its psychological cost. Paganism, for all its raw honesty, often lacked the moral structure needed to contain destructive instincts. It flirted with chaos, with the seductive pull of fate and raw archetypal possession. Christianity, on the other hand, sometimes repressed the unconscious too deeply. It made shadow work taboo. Sexuality became sin. Rage became the devil. And when energies are pushed too far down, they erupt in distortion, religious wars, Puritanism, even modern neurosis. So what's the modern takeaway? It's not about choosing sides. It's about seeing the psychic function in both. If you constantly chase freedom without responsibility, you're reenacting pagan archetypes uncontained. If you cling to guilt, self-denial, and perfectionism, you might be over-identified with Christian ideals. Integration means balancing both, honoring instinct without being ruled by it, and practicing virtue without moral rigidity. It's a tightrope, but it's also the road to spiritual growth. And here's where Jung's brilliance really shines. He didn't ask people to return to ancient rituals or blindly adopt religious dogmas. He asked for awareness, for people to see the archetypes alive within them, and to choose consciously how to engage. Because if you don't, collective energies will choose for you. And that's when unconscious identification becomes dangerous. Chapter 6. Danger of unconscious identification with collective energies. When you unconsciously merge with collective energies, you stop being a person and start becoming a mouthpiece. Carl Jung warned that what we fail to make conscious, we experience as fate. And nowhere is that more evident than in the seduction of mass movements. The individual dissolves into the crowd, carried by the emotional momentum of nationalism, ideology, or moral crusade. What feels like clarity is often ego inflation fueled by shadow. You're not choosing. You're being chosen by the collective unconscious. Take a look at history. From revolutions to cults, every mass movement begins with an archetypal surge: righteousness, victimhood, salvation. These energies aren't bad in themselves, but when they're unconscious, they possess. Suddenly, us versus them becomes holy. The ego feels inflated with moral purpose, but it's really being hijacked by unresolved projections. That's how intelligent people justify cruelty. That's how genocide gets wrapped in flags and prayers. This isn't hyperbole. It's shadow work neglected on a cultural scale. Even in modern life, this plays out subtly. You join an online tribe, convinced you're standing for truth. But are you? Or are you just feeding your identity with likes and outrage? Jung would say, pause, observe, ask, is this my voice? Or am I echoing the collective energy of a wounded archetype? This is where virtue matters, not as dogma, but as a stabilizer. Practicing patience, empathy, and introspection helps you stay grounded when the world wants you reactive. And let's not pretend we're immune. Even spiritual seekers fall into this trap. They project the self onto gurus, movements, or cosmic ideas. Suddenly, their personal path becomes universal truth, and anyone who disagrees is asleep. That's not individuation. That's projection dressed in sacred robes. Jung called this participation mystique, when your sense of self melts into a larger group and you lose the ability to discern what's truly yours. So how do you avoid it? You don't hide from collective forces. You face them with awareness. You trace your reactions. You examine your beliefs. You sit with your discomfort. And when the ego trembles in the presence of something bigger, you remember, the goal is not to reject the collective, but to engage with it without losing your center. Because only then can you understand how archetypes, projection, and identity are woven together. Chapter 7. Archetypes, Projection, and Identity. Archetypes don't knock politely. They crash through your life in the form of obsessions, relationships, and identity crises. Carl Jung taught that archetypes like the anima, animus, and the shadow aren't random. They're blueprints buried in the collective unconscious. When you meet someone and feel an intense pull, love at first sight, irrational hatred, deep fascination, chances are it's not about them. It's your unconscious reflecting an archetype right back at you. Identity, then, isn't formed in isolation. It's shaped through projection and reaction. Imagine someone who constantly seeks approval from authority figures. On the surface, it might look like ambition or respect. But dig deeper, and you might find the projection of a divine father archetype, something they never integrated from childhood. That's the tricky part. You think you're chasing goals, but you might be chasing archetypes. This is why self-awareness isn't optional. It's essential. If you don't recognize the symbolic forces shaping your identity, you'll end up living someone else's story. The ego, being small and fragile compared to the vastness of the unconscious, grabs onto these projections for stability. You become the good daughter, the rebel, the healer, the misunderstood genius. These roles offer comfort, but they also become prisons. To grow, you have to peel them off, one by one. A good place to start. Write down the roles you play in different environments, at home, at work, in relationships. Ask, am I choosing this? Or has it been assigned to me by unseen forces? It's also helpful to study stories. Not just fairy tales, but movies, myths, novels. Pay attention to characters who resonate deeply with you. Heroes, villains, lovers, sages. They're mirrors. Jung believed that fiction externalizes the archetypes so we can see them more clearly. If you're drawn to someone like Neo in The Matrix, or Morpheus, or even Loki from Norse mythology, ask yourself, what part of me is this character calling forth? That's where the real identity work begins. Because here's the paradox. Your identity only becomes truly yours when you stop identifying with it. You realize you're not just a collection of traits. You're a living process of integration. And when projections are withdrawn and the archetypes are seen for what they are, the self begins to emerge, not as an image, but as a dynamic center. But that center won't hold unless you cultivate something crucial in the face of all this unconscious chaos: virtue. Chapter 8. The role of virtue in dealing with the unconscious. Virtue isn't about playing nice, it's psychological armor. Carl Jung emphasized that dealing with the unconscious isn't for the faint of heart. Without virtue, the ego either inflates or collapses. Think of it like this. The unconscious is a wild jungle filled with treasure and traps. You don't walk into that space without tools. And your best tools? Humility, honesty, courage, and patience. These aren't just moral ideals. They're stabilizers that keep you from being swallowed by your own shadow. Humility, for example, lets you admit that you don't fully know yourself. And that's a good thing. It opens the door to real self-knowledge, not self-flattery. Honesty forces you to stop justifying your projections and start owning them. It says, yes, that rage I felt, that's mine. Courage allows you to look at the things that terrify you in your psyche without blinking. And patience reminds you that individuation isn't a sprint. It's a lifetime dance with the unknown. Take spiritual bypassing. You meet someone who claims to be all love and light, yet erupts in passive aggression when challenged. That's not enlightenment. It's ego in disguise. Without virtue, the unconscious content gets spiritualized but not integrated. Real spiritual growth requires psychological grounding. So if you want to practice, start small. Try radical self-honesty in your journal. Reflect on where you're pretending, performing, or avoiding. Or go deeper. Seek mentorship, shadow work, or study texts like the Red Book by Jung himself. And don't underestimate the power of silence. In moments when the ego wants to react, virtue whispers, wait. This is how you begin to reclaim power, not through control, but through integration. Because when you choose to respond rather than react, you're no longer a puppet of unconscious contents. You become a conscious co-creator of your reality. And that's where destiny begins to shift, not by chance, but by conscious moral effort aligned with your deeper nature. Still, it's not just about becoming better. It's about becoming real. Because when virtue meets the unconscious, you don't just survive the inner journey, you alchemize it. You turn projections into wisdom, shadows into fuel, and chaos into clarity. And just when you think the work is done, something unexpected emerges from the depths, calling for even deeper awareness, reminding you that the path of individuation never truly ends. Conclusion. Were you still asleep in your own life? Now that you've seen how the self operates beyond the ego, how projection, archetypes, and unconscious forces shape your entire experience, you're faced with a choice. You can keep pretending you're just your thoughts, your job, your wounds, or you can begin the real work, the work of individuation, the work that transforms chaos into clarity. The truth is, no one's coming to save you. Not a guru, not a philosophy, not a movement. But you were never meant to be saved. You were meant to awaken. So ask yourself, were you still asleep in your own life? What beliefs have you swallowed without ever examining their origin? What roles are you still performing because they feel safe but hollow? Jung didn't want disciples. He wanted individuals. People brave enough to confront their own shadow, their own projections, their own destiny. And maybe that's you. Maybe that's why you're here. Not to follow another dogma, but to begin the journey back to yourself. If this lit something up inside you, don't let it die out. Apply what you've learned. Start a dream journal. Study the ion. Notice your triggers, your patterns, your masks. Make virtue your weapon and awareness your compass. And if you're serious about going deeper into this work, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We're not here to play small. We're here to integrate the unconscious, to awaken the self, and to walk that path together.